They say some places on Earth hold on to evil, like a sponge holds water. Deep in the remote interior of Brazil, far from any city lights or paved roads, there's a stretch of land that locals refuse to speak about after sunset. The old-timers will tell you that certain names should never be whispered in the dark, and certain stories should stay buried with the dead. But tonight, I'm going to break that silence, because what happened to my cousin Marcus last month, well, some things are too important to keep quiet. Legend speaks of a man who once lived in those forgotten hills, a man whose cruelty knew no bounds. But this isn't just folklore. This is real. And he's still out there. In the 1800s, when that region was nothing but scattered farms and endless wilderness, there lived a landowner who ruled his territory like a medieval tyrant. He was a giant of a man, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with hands like tree trunks and a voice that could be heard for miles across the valleys. This man took pleasure in others' suffering. Workers who couldn't meet his impossible demands would be tied to posts under the scorching Brazilian sun for days, given just enough water to keep them alive and suffering. Children who wandered onto his property would disappear, and their parents would find only torn clothing by the river days later. Women traveling alone through his territory. Well, their families learned to take the long way around, adding weeks to their journeys just to avoid his land. He kept a collection of whips made from different materials, leather, rope, and some say even human skin. His favorite punishment was to drag people behind his horse for miles across the rocky terrain while he laughed and whooped like a madman. The sound of his voice echoing through those hills became a warning to every living soul. Run, hide, pray, he doesn't see you. But his most terrifying trait was his voice. When he was angry, which was often, he would release these bone-chilling screams that seemed to shake the very earth. Animals would flee for miles. Birds would drop dead from the trees. Even the wind would stop, as if nature itself was too terrified to make a sound. The locals began calling him the Shouter. The Shouter's reign of terror came to an end in 1847, but not through justice or heroism. Disease took him, a slow, agonizing death that lasted months. As he lay dying, witnesses say his screams of pain and rage could be heard from sunrise to sunset, echoing across the entire region like the howls of a wounded demon. When he finally died, something strange happened. The ground where they tried to bury him wouldn't stay closed. Every morning, the grave would be torn open from the inside, the coffin splintered into pieces, and the body gone. They tried burning him, but the flames would die out no matter how much fuel they added. The river refused to carry away his remains. The water would literally flow around his body, leaving it high and dry on the banks. After 7 failed attempts at disposal, the locals simply gave up. His body vanished on its own, and they hoped their nightmare was over. They were wrong. The supernatural terror begins. Within weeks of his death, the screaming started again. Not the painful cries of a dying man, but something far worse, the enraged howls of something that refused to stay dead. Travelers began reporting encounters with a massive shadow that would chase them through the forest, always accompanied by those horrible screams that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The first confirmed victim was a merchant named Santos, found 3 days after he'd gone missing. His body was discovered miles from any road, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His hair turned completely white. But here's what made everyone's blood run cold. Carved into the tree above his body were claw marks that spelled out words. Not Portuguese, not Spanish, not any language anyone recognized. And emanating from those marks was the faint sound of screaming, even weeks later. More disappearances followed. Always the same pattern. People would be found days later, sometimes alive, but completely insane, babbling about the voice in the darkness and the giant shadow that screams. Those who survived were never the same. They'd wake up screaming every night, claiming they could still hear him calling their names. Fast forward to today. That region is still largely uninhabited, but occasionally, researchers, adventure seekers, or people just passing through have encounters that defy explanation. My cousin Marcus is a geologist. Last month, he was part of a team surveying mineral deposits in that exact area. He's always been the skeptical type, never believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. That changed on March 15th. They'd set up camp about 2 miles from where historians believe the Shouters' property once stood. Marcus told me that the first night was unusually quiet. No insects, no nightbirds, nothing, just complete, oppressive silence. Around 2 a.m., that silence was shattered by what Marcus described as the most horrifying sound I've ever heard in my life. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but then it grew louder and more defined. It was screaming, but not human screaming. This was something else entirely, something filled with centuries of rage and hatred. The sound seemed to come from the ground itself, rising up through the earth and into the night air. Marcus's team grabbed their equipment and ran. But as they fled through the forest, the screaming followed them. It wasn't echoing from behind, it was coming from ahead of them, as if something was circling around to cut off their escape. Every time they changed direction, the voice was there, waiting. The personal testimony. Marcus made it out that night, but something followed him home. For weeks after returning to São Paulo, he'd wake up to the sound of screaming outside his apartment window. He'd look out, and there would be nothing there, just the normal city sounds. But the screaming would continue for hours. Then the phone calls started. His phone would ring at exactly 2 a.m. every night. When he'd answer, there would be silence for a moment, followed by that same horrific screaming. But now it seemed to know his name. It would scream Marcus over and over until he hung up. He changed his number 3 times. It didn't matter. Last week, Marcus called me in tears. He said he'd been driving home from work when he looked in his rearview mirror and saw a massive figure standing in the road behind him. Even from a distance, he could hear it screaming his name. When he looked again, it was gone. But now he's convinced that the shouter has marked him somehow, claimed him. 3 days ago, I decided to help my cousin. I drove out to that remote region myself, determined to find some logical explanation for what was happening to him. I'm a journalist. I investigate things, find the truth behind the stories. I wish I had never gone. I found the area where Marcus's team had camped. Even in broad daylight, something felt wrong about that place. The air was too still, too quiet. The trees seemed to lean away from certain spots, as if even they were trying to avoid something. As the sun began to set, I heard it. At first, it was just a whisper on the wind, barely audible, almost like my imagination. But as darkness fell, it grew stronger, not just screaming, but words. Angry, hateful words in that same unknown language that had been carved into trees for over a century. Then, I saw the shadow. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall and impossibly wide. It moved between the trees like smoke, but I could feel its weight, its presence. And when it turned toward me, I understood why people's hair turns white from terror. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, burned with a hatred so pure and intense that just looking at them made me feel like my soul was being scorched. It screamed my name, not Marcus's name, my name. How could it know my name? I ran like I've never run in my life, but I could hear it following, crashing through the forest behind me, screaming threats and promises of what it would do when it caught me. I made it to my car and drove for 6 hours straight, not stopping until I reached the city. That was 3 days ago. Since then, my phone has been ringing every night at 2 a.m. I haven't answered it. I won't answer it. Marcus called me this morning. He said the screaming has stopped for him, but now he's worried about me. He thinks the shouter has found a new target, a new person to torment. I'm writing this story as a warning. If you ever find yourself in the remote interior of Brazil, if you ever hear stories about the shouter, turn around and leave. Don't investigate. Don't try to debunk it. Don't try to help. Some evils are meant to stay buried in forgotten places. Some voices should never be answered. And if you're reading this and you start hearing screaming in the distance, whatever you do, don't look for the source. Because the shouter doesn't just want to scare you. He wants to add your voice to his eternal chorus of the damned. As I finish typing this, I can hear something outside my window. It sounds like screaming, but that's impossible. I'm on the 12th floor. The screaming is getting louder. It knows my name.